In today's video, we're covering US 84 eastbound and how the control cities along the route are mid. US 84 is 1,919 miles long, going through Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. US 84's western beginning is in Pagosa Springs at US 160, signed east for Alamosa, and we're now signed east for Chama, which is in New Mexico and actually the best thing to sign here despite its population. And just a quick explanation to why I said this. Basically, from Pagosa Springs to Chama, there's like no civilization and you kind of need services, so yeah. On the mileage sign, Chromos are secondary in 23 miles and Chama is our primary in 45. Here we meet County Road 119, Light Plant Road. This intersection was requested by Seahawks fan for life. There's nothing else of importance in Colorado, so here we are at the New Mexico border and its state welcome sign, which I feel like it's kind of too much, but that's just me. When we meet US 64, the first significant intersection in the state, we're now concurrent with it, still signed for Chama. On the mileage sign though, Chama is now our secondary and Española is now our primary in 92 miles, which is the bigger city and is the next control city after Chama. And because of how close we are to Chama, I'm fine with this mileage sign. In Chama, we meet New Mexico 17 and we're now signed for Tierra Amarilla and Española. Tierra Amarilla is for US 64 and US 84 and Española is for US 84 only. On the mileage sign, Tierra Amarilla is on the top line 15 miles, and now Española is our secondary in 81 miles, while Santa Fe is the new primary in 106 miles. This is fine, but I think Española should be co-signed with Santa Fe because Española is still a micropolitan area and a big city for New Mexico standards. When US 64 leaves us, it is now signed east for Tres Piedras and Taos. From US 64, we can see that we're signed for Española only now, but as I said earlier, signed Santa Fe as well. Here we meet US 285, and we're now going to be concurrent with it towards Santa Fe, and we're still signed south for Española, and we're now also signed for Santa Fe. When we meet New Mexico 399 and Española, we're now solely signed south for Santa Fe. In Pewaukee, we meet New Mexico 502, the Los Alamos Highway, signed west for Los Alamos, and we are signed for Santa Fe still. This exit was requested by the times are here. When we reach Santa Fe, we meet New Mexico 599, the Santa Fe Relief Route, also known as the Veterans Memorial Highway. This exit was also requested by the times are here. We're now about to run concurrent with I-25 for a wrong way concurrency, and US 84 is signed for Santa Rosa. US 285 is signed for Clients Corners, and I-25 is signed for Las Vegas, and no, not Nevada, Las Vegas, New Mexico, with a grand total population of 12,905. Just sign Denver. Why are we being provincial? This is terrible. I hate New Mexico DOT so much sometimes, y'all. Here at exit 290, US 285 leaves us, still signed south for Clients Corners. 49 miles later at exit 339, US 84 leaves I-25, signed south for Romeroville and Santa Rosa. Why are we citing Romeroville? It's a region that we're already in. Just sign Santa Rosa by itself. Also, Santa Rosa is fine for a US highway, although it should not be signed on I-40 at all. Sign Amarillo instead. On the mileage sign though, Fort Sumner becomes our primary in 109 miles, while Santa Rosa is our secondary in 59 miles. Fort Sumner is literally tinier than Santa Rosa. Keep Santa Rosa on the sign by itself. Eventually, we meet I-40 and we're now going to run concurrently with it, and we're also becoming unsigned. And also, as I said for US 84, Santa Rosa was fine, but now we're at I-40 and it shouldn't be signed. Yet it is anyways because this is New Mexico DOT. Sign Amarillo instead. Unfortunately, the mileage sign doesn't get any better. Santa Rosa has now become the secondary in 17 miles, and Tucumcari is now our primary control city in 74 miles. Just sign Amarillo. It is not that hard. When we reach Santa Rosa, I-40 is signed east for Tucumcari now. Once again, just sign Amarillo, and we're now joining I-40 business side for Santa Rosa, and we're still unsigned for some reason. Here we meet US 54, and it's now concurrent with us, and we're now signed for Tucumcari, which is for US 54, and signing Tucumcari on it is fine because unlike I-40, it's a US highway and held the lower standards. We actually meet I-40 3 times in Santa Rosa, and this is the second interchange where no highway at all is signed for some reason, only mentioning Santa Rosa on the sign. Can we get the highways on the sign as well? But anyways, US 54 also joins I-40 here towards Tucumcari, leaving US 84. 2 miles later, here's the third and last interchange of I-40, and we're now signed south for Fort Sumner, and despite its population, it being signed is fine for the same reasons as Chama was signed, for services, and also you meet US 60 and Fort Sumner anyways, so yeah. On the mileage sign, Fort Sumner is now the secondary in 38 miles, and Clovis is the primary in 98, and in this case, Clovis is the bigger city, so it is fine being on the bottom line for the mileage sign. In Fort Sumner, Sumner, we meet US 60 and we're now concurrent with it, signed for Melrose and Clovis. In Melrose, we meet New Mexico 267 and we're now solely signed for Clovis. In Clovis, US 70 joins the mix and we're now signed for Texaco, Farwell, and Amarillo. Texaco is for all three highways, Farwell is for US 70 and US 84, and Amarillo is for US 60. Honestly, I think the sign should just be Amarillo, Farwell, and Lubbock. Lubbock would be for US 84, and then when you get into Texas, then you can co-sign the other cities I know before Lubbock on US 84. Right before we cross into Texas, US 60 leaves us heading east towards Amarillo, and right after that, we cross the border into Texas with the only sign of that being the Palmer County line sign, although the construction could be taken as crossing the state line into Texas as well, because it's Texas, you know? East of Farwell on the mileage sign, Muleshoe is now our control city in 20 miles, and as I aforementioned, Lubbock should be signed as well, and therefore put on the mileage sign. Also, back there, you can see the Texas State Welcome sign. When we reach Muleshoe, US 70 turns left, leaving US 84. On the mileage side, Littlefield is our new control city in 30 miles. Once again, add Lubbock to the sign as well. Southeast of Littlefield on the mileage sign, Anton is our secondary in 9 miles, and Lubbock is finally signed as our primary control city in 33. In Lubbock, we meet I-27, and we're now signed east for Post. When we reach Post, we have a very short concurrency with US 380, forming a brief wrong-way concurrency with it. Literally 0.1 mile later, US 380 leaves us. On the next mileage sign, Snyder is our secondary in 29 miles, and Sweetwater is our new control city in 68. In Snyder, we meet US 180, signed west for Lamesa and east for Roby. This exit was requested by Quad Roblox. At that same exit, we're now signed east for Roscoe. Why are we being inconsistent? Keep Sweetwater as a control city. It's also the largest city compared to them. Texas DOT sucks sometimes. In Roscoe, we meet I-20 and we're now running concurrent with it eastbound towards Abilene, while westbound is signed for El Paso. At exit 244, we meet Texas 70 Business and Texas 70, with the former going into Sweetwater and the latter running concurrently with us. 3 miles later, Texas 70 leaves us, signed north for Roby. When US 84 leaves I-20, it is signed east for Fort Worth, and we're signed for Abilene along with I-20 Business. US 83 and 277 are now joining us, and we're now signed for Ballinger, Coleman, and San Angelo. Ballinger is for US 83, Coleman is for US 84, and San Angelo is for US 277. Here, US 277 is leaving us heading south towards San Angelo, signed for South 14th Street. The next exit after that is Southwest Drive, which was requested by Kuwata Roblox. Eventually, later after Abilene, US 83 leaves us, still signed for Ballinger, and we're signed for Coleman still. On the mileage side, Lawn is our secondary in 7 miles, and Coleman is still our primary in 36. In Coleman, we meet US 283, and it's now running concurrent with us southbound. Shortly after that, we turn left, and we're now signed for Santa Ana and Brownwood. Santa Ana is for US 84 and 283, while Brownwood's for US 84 only. In Santa Ana, US 67 is now joining the mix, and we're still signed for Brownwood along with Brady. Brownwood is for US 67 and US 84, while Brady's for US 283. At the next right, US 283 leaves us, signed south for Brady. When we reach Brownwood, US 377 joins the concurrency. US 183 is now also joining the mix, and we're now signed for Comanche and Goldthwaite. Comanche is for US 67 and US 377, and Goldthwaite is for US 84 and US 183. When US 67 and 377 leave us, they're still signed north for Comanche, and we're still signed for Goldthwaite, but we're now also signed for Lampasas, which is for US 183. When US 183 leaves us, we're now signed east for Gatesville and Waco. Waco can be signed by itself, unlike Lubbock. On the mileage sign, Gatesville is the secondary in 51 miles, and Waco is the primary in 90. In Waco, we meet I-35, and we're now signed for Waco Drive and Belmead Drive. When we meet Texas Loop 340 in Belmead, a suburb of Waco, we're now signed for 2 Texas 31, Mahia and Corsicana. Mahia is for US 84 and Corsicana is for Texas 31. When Texas 31 leaves us, it is signed north for Corsicana still in addition to Hubbard, and we're still signed east from Mahia in addition to Fairfield. On the mileage sign, Prairie Hill is our secondary in 13 miles, and Mahia is our primary in 31 miles, with Fairfield nowhere on the mileage sign, but I think it's fine because Mahia is the larger city anyways. In Mahia, we meet Texas 14, and we're now signed east for Teague, which is fine for the same reasons as Mahia being signed up at mileage sign without Fairfield being on it. In Teague, when we meet Farm to Market Road 553, we're now signed east for Fairfield again. In Fairfield, we meet I-45, and we're still signed east for Fairfield, referring to its downtown. When we reach Fairfield's downtown, we meet Texas 75, and we're now signed east for Palestine. Here, US 79 meets US 84, and it's now going to run concurrent with it to Palestine. When we reach Palestine, US 79 leaves us, signed north for Tyler, and we're now signed east for Rusk. Shortly after that, US 287 is now going to run concurrently with us, and we're now signed for Crockett and Rusk. Crockett is for US 287, and as aforementioned, Rusk is for US 84. Here, US 287 leaves us as we turn left. On the mileage sign, Maydell is our secondary in 19 miles, and Rusk is still our primary in 31. In Rusk, we meet US 69, signed north for Jacksonville and south for Alto. This intersection was requested by AR Nathan. From US 69, we're now signed east for New Summerfield and Mount Enterprise. For starters, New Summerfield isn't even on US 84. It's on Texas 110, which is shortly meets afterwards. And secondly, Mount Enterprise has 510 people. It shouldn't be signed at all, yet it is anyways, probably because of a US 259 intersection that's there, but no other city we cross to in Texas has more than 1,000 people, so I think Mansfield and Louisiana should be the next control city. Anyways, here we meet Texas 110, signed north for New Summerfield. In Mount Enterprise, we meet US 259, and we're now signed east for Timpson, as I said earlier, signed Mansfield. When we reach Timpson, we meet US 59, and it's now running concurrent with us towards downtown. And also, I don't know which intersection he wanted, but I'm gonna do this one anyways. I digress. AR Nathan requested this intersection. Past downtown, we meet Texas Spur 470, and we're now signed for Tanaha. Once again, just signed Mansfield already. In Tanaha, US 59 leaves us, signed north for Carthage, and we're signed east for Joaquin and Mansfield. Just signed Mansfield by itself. We also meet US 96 here, which was requested by AR Nathan as well. We're now crossing over the Sabine River into Louisiana, and here's the state welcome sign. It's kind of mid. These ones are way better. In Mansfield, we meet US 171 and are now briefly concurrent with it. And here, US 171 leaves us while we turn right. When we meet I-49, we're now signed east for Grand Bayou. And compared to some of the other mid-control cities on this highway, none of them are as bad as this one. So, Grand Bayou is an unincorporated community. Why is this signed? Just sign Coushatta! In Grand Bayou, we meet Louisiana 1, which is probably the reason it's signed. But anyways, we're now concurrent with it, and we're signed for Natchitoches, which is for Louisiana 1. When Louisiana 1 leaves us, US 371 joins us, and we're now signed for Coushatta. When we reach Coushatta, US 371 leaves us. Shortly after that, we meet US 71 and are now concurrent with it, and we still don't have a control city. When we meet Louisiana 784, we're signed for Campty. In Campty, on the mileage sign, our secondary is Clarence in 7 miles, and Alexandria is our primary in 64, which is for US 71. Winfield should also be on the mileage sign, which is for US 84. When US 71 leaves us, we're now signed east for Winfield. In Winfield, we meet US 167 and are now concurrent with it, signed for Alexandria, which is for US 167. When US 167 leaves us, we have no control city. On the mileage sign, Joyce is our secondary in a mile, and Tullis is our primary in 21 miles, which has a population of 305. Why is this being signed? Sign Jenna instead, or even better, Natchez! In Tullis, Jenna is our secondary in 16 miles, and Natchez is surprisingly our primary in 69 miles. But this is Louisiana. Will Natchez really stay as the control city? In Jenna, we can see that no, Natchez does not stay as the control city. Our new control city is Jonesville in 24 miles. Signing Natchez was great. It should be kept as the control city. Why are we not signing it anymore? When we reach Jonesville, we meet Louisiana 124, and we're now signed east for Faraday. Why the inconsistency? Just sign Natchez again. In Faraday, we meet US 425, which is going to be concurrent with us till Natchez, and we're now signed for Vidalia. Just sign Natchez at this point, or even co-sign it with Vidalia, which you could have potentially done with Jenna and Jonesville, but I think from both cities, Natchez should have been signed by itself, and in Faraday, you can co-sign Vidalia with Natchez. In Vidalia, we meet Louisiana 131, which serves as one of the many parts of the Great River Road, and this is also Magnolia Street, which was requested by Outbreak Station because it turns into Martin Luther King Avenue, which leads to Riverview RV Park and Resort, where he camped at. We're now crossing over the Mississippi River into Mississippi. The state welcome sign is kind of mid, not gonna lie. Here, US 425 ends and US 98 begins, and we also meet US 61 signed south for Woodville and Baton Rouge, and we're now concurrent with US 61 and US 98 signed for Vicksburg and Brookhaven. Vicksburg is for US 61 and Brookhaven is for US 84. When US 61 leaves us, the control cities are the exact same, but we're now also signed east for Macomb, which is for US 98. On the mileage sign, we can see that Brookhaven is 56 miles away and Macomb is 64 miles away. When US 98 leaves us, it is still signed east for Macomb. From US 98, we can see that we're still signed east for Brookhaven as well. When we meet I-55, we're now signed east for South Brookhaven. I mean, it's not wrong, but like, why? Just sign the next control city, Monticello, or even co-sign it with Laurel. Also, this exit was requested by Matt Weebler. When we meet US 51 shortly after I-55, we're now signed east for Monticello, which should probably be co-signed with Laurel. And also, I've made some videos on US 51 that you should check out after this video. video, and on top of that, this intersection was also requested by Matt Weebler. And on the mileage side, Laurel actually does become the control city with Monticello on the top line and Collins as the secondary. In Monticello, we're now signed east for Silver Creek and Prentice. Neither of these should be signed at all. What should be signed instead is Collins and Laurel. In Prentice, we meet Mississippi 13, and we're now signed east for Collins. Laurel should be signed here as well. When we reach Collins, we meet US 49, and we're now signed east for Laurel. In Laurel, we are now concurrent with I-59 and Mississippi 15, signed for Meridian and Waynesboro. Meridian is for I-59 and Waynesboro is for US 84. Here, Mississippi 15 leaves us signed south for Richton and Cook Avenue, and we can see that we're also about to leave I-59 signed east for Waynesboro and Chantilly Street. And here's the actual exit where US 84 leaves I-59. On the mileage sign, Waynesboro is our secondary in 28 miles, and the Alabama state line is our primary in 43. In Waynesboro, we meet US 45 and are now signed east for Silas, which is in Alabama, which has a population of 365. Why is this being signed? Grove Hill should be signed instead. And here we cross into Alabama with no state welcome sign, only a Alabama state line sign. In Silas, we meet Alabama 17, and we're now signed east for Grove Hill, which should have been signed since Waynesboro. On the mileage sign, Coffeyville is our secondary in 17 miles, and Grove Hill is still our primary in 37. In Grove Hill, we meet US 43, which doesn't give us any control cities, but we also meet Alabama 295 right here, which shows us that we're now signed east for Monroeville. The thing about Monroeville is that we actually don't go through it, only meeting highways that go to it, but it is still a reasonably sized city for a US highway control city, so I think it's justified. But I think it should also be co-signed with the control city after it, Evergreen. Anyways, here we meet Alabama 47, which will take you to Monroeville, and we're now signed east for Evergreen. In Evergreen, we meet I-65, and we're still signed east for Evergreen, referring to its downtown. Shortly after that, we meet US 31 and are now concurrent with it throughout Evergreen. When US 31 leaves us, it is signed north for McKenzie and Greenville, and we are now signed east for Andalusia. On the mileage sign, Andalusia is still our control city in 24 miles, being the only city on the mileage sign. When we reach Andalusia, we meet US 29, and we are now running concurrently with it. When US 29 leaves us, it is signed north for Dozer and Brantley, and we are now signed east for Opp. We actually bypass Ops downtown, and we're now also running concurrently with US 331 signed for Brantley and Laverne, which are both for US 331. When US 331 leaves us, it still has the same control cities, and we're now signed east for Elba. In Elba, we meet Alabama 87, and we're now signed east for Enterprise. In Enterprise, when we meet Alabama 248, we're now signed east for Dauphin. When we reach Dauphin, we meet US 231 signed south for Panama City, and we're now running concurrently with a northbound signed for Ozark and Headland. Ozark is for US 231 and Headland is for US 84, kind of. Here, US 231 leaves us, and we're now signed for 2 US 431. Shortly after that, we meet US 431, and we're now running concurrently with it southbound. Also, it's on this picture, but US 431 northbound goes to Headland, which is why Headland was kind of signed for US 84 because it met US 431, which then went to Headland. When US 431 leaves us, it is signed for Panama City and Enterprise because it meets US 231, which goes to Panama City, and it also ends it, and it also loops back up to US 84, which then goes to Enterprise. Anyways, we're now signed east for Ashford. I couldn't find anything in Ashford, but we're now crossing over the Chattahoochee River into Georgia. We get no state welcome sign, but anyways, here we meet Georgia 370, and we're now signed east for Donaldsonville. Bainbridge to be co-signed with Donaldsonville, though, because of our population. This intersection was also requested by Jameson James Stack Swick. When we reach Donaldsonville, we're now signed east for Bainbridge. On the mileage sign, Iron City is on the top line in 4 miles. Brinson is the secondary in 9, and Bainbridge is still our primary in 21. When we reach Bainbridge, we meet US 27, and we're now concurrent with it. When US 27 leaves us, it is signed south for Tallahassee, and we're now signed east for Cairo. In Cairo, we meet Georgia 93, and we're now signed east for Thomasville. North of Thomasville, we meet US 19, and we're now concurrent with it signed for Valdosta and Thomasville, and it is signed north for Albany, although I think it should be clear that US 84 is going to Thomasville as well. When US 84 leaves US 19, we're now signed east for Quitman and Valdosta, but because of how much larger Valdosta is, I think it should be signed by itself. In Quitman, we meet US 221, and we are now concurrent with it towards Valdosta, and we're also signed for Adel, which is on Georgia 76, which we meet shortly after this. Here we meet Georgia 76, signed north for Morven and Adel, and we also meet Georgia 333, signed north for 2 Georgia 133 and Moultrie, and US 221 is now also signed north for Lakeland, and we are also signed east for Homerville and Waycross. I think the control cities for US 221 and US 84 are super extra. Just sign Valdosta.
Literally, you don't have to sign anything else.
When we meet I-75, we're signed for Valdosta still, referring to its downtown. Here, US 221 leaves us, and we also meet US 41 here as well. When we meet US 129, we're now signed east for Homerville. In Homerville, we meet US 441, and we're now signed east for Waycross. When we reach Waycross, we meet US 1, US 23, and US 82, and in concurrent with all three, signed for Jessup and Brunswick. Jessup is for US 84, and Brunswick is for US 82. Here, US 84 leaves the concurrency, and we're now signed east for Blackshear, Jessup, and Savannah. Blackshear is unnecessary because Jessup is larger than it, and Savannah is fine, I guess. It's not really necessary, but it's cool that it's on the sign because we eventually meet US 17 and I-95, which go there. In Blackshear, we're now signed east for Patterson, which is even worse, having a population of 773. And also, where'd Jessup go? Just sign Jessup. When we reach Patterson, we meet Georgia 32 and Jessup returns as the control city. On the mileage side, we can see that Jessup is 23 miles away. In Jessup, we meet US 341, signed north for Baxley, and we're now signed east for Ludowici. Just sign Hinesville, it's the larger city and also a metropolitan area. US 25 and US 301 are now joining us towards Ludowici. When we reach Ludowici, US 25 and US 301 leave us, signed north for Glenville, and we are now signed east for Hinesville. I couldn't find anything in Hinesville, but anyways, we're now signed east for I-95, which is actually the best thing that can be signed here. On the mileage side, I-95 is on the top line in 4 miles, and Sunbury State Historic Site is on the bottom line in 10. And finally, here is the end of US 84 at I-95, signed north for Savannah and south for Brunswick and Jacksonville. Also, sign Jacksonville by itself, don't be provincial. After some good, some mid, and some bad control cities overall making the control cities for the highway mid, let's review what the control city should actually be.
Geography train here. So Extreme Geography kind of gave up on this voiceover, so I'm doing it for him. Anyways, for Eastbound, the control cities should be Chama, Tierra, Amarillo, and Española when current with US 64, Española and Santa Fe when leaving US 64, Santa Fe by itself after passing Española, Colorado Springs, don't sign Las Vegas, and also sign Klein's Corner and Santa Rosa when concurrent with I-25 and US 285. Colorado Springs and Santa Rosa when US 285 leaves, and once again, don't sign Las Vegas. Santa Rosa when we leave I-25, don't sign Romeoville. Amarillo when we join I-40, US 84 does not need a control city while concurrent with I-40, and don't sign Santa Rosa or Tucumcari. Santa Rosa when we leave I-40, Fort Sumner when we meet I-40 a third time in Santa Rosa. Clovis, Melrose doesn't have to be signed. Amarillo, Farwell, and Lubbock when concurrent with US 60 and US 70. Farwell and Lubbock when US 60 leaves us. Muleshoe and Lubbock after Farwell. Littlefield and Lubbock after Muleshoe. Lubbock by itself after Littlefield. Post. Sweetwater, don't switch to Roscoe, and then sign Abilene. Also sign DFW when joining I-20. Abilene by itself when leaving I-20. Bullinger, Coleman, and San Angelo when joining US 83 and US 277. Bullinger and Coleman when US 277 leaves us. Coleman by itself after US 83 leaves us. Santa Ana and Brownwood and Coleman when US 283 joins us. Brownwood and Brady when we reach Santa Ana. Brownwood by itself when US 283 leaves us. Comanche and Goldthwaite when we're in Brownwood and concurrent with US 67, US 183, and US 377. Goldthwaite and Lampasas when splitting from US 67 and US 377. Waco when US 183 leaves us, and don't sign Gatesville. Xia and Fairfield don't have to be signed yet. Teague, Fairfield, Palestine, Rusk. Crockett and Rusk when US 287 joins us in Palestine. Rusk by itself again when US 287 leaves us. Mansfield, when you get to Rusk, don't sign New Summerfield. Mount Enterprise, Timpson, or Tanaha. Coshada, don't sign Grand Bayou. Natchitoches and Coshada when meeting Louisiana 1 and running concurrent with each other. Coshada by itself when leaving Louisiana 1. Campty, Winfield, and Alexandria when concurrent with US 71. Winfield by itself when leaving US 71. Natchez, when you get to Winfield, don't sign Tulos, Jenna, Jonesville, Faraday, Vidalia, and Natchez when you get to Faraday. Vicksburg and Brookhaven when concurrent with US 61 and US 98. Brookhaven and Macomb when US 61 leaves us. Brookhaven by itself when US 98 leaves us. Monticello and Laurel, don't sign Monticello by itself. Collins and Lauren, don't sign Silver Creek or Prentice. Laurel by itself and Collins. Meridian and Waynesboro when concurrent with I-59. Waynesboro by itself when leaving I-59. Grove Hill, Skips, Sillas, Monroeville, and Evergreen, don't sign Monroeville by itself. Evergreen after meeting Alabama 47. Andalusia, Elba and Enterprise, don't sign Enterprise by itself. Dothan, Ashford, Donaldson, and Bainbridge, don't sign Donaldsville by itself. Cairo, Thomasville, Valdosta, don't sign Quitman. Homerville, Waycross, Jessup, and Brunswick, Jacksonville should be signed for US 1 and US 23 when in Raycross. Jessup by itself when leaving the concurrency, don't sign Blackshear or Patterson. Hinesville, skip Ludau, eats C, then Midway, and I-95.
Hey guys, I'm back. Anyways, go sub to train. Like seriously, please. I was seriously considering dropping this video. Obviously, I was joking when I was thinking about it, but like that voiceover was seriously driving me insane. I think I would have lost my sanity. But go sub to train. He doesn't upload, but he will eventually. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed today's video, please subscribe. I also have more videos on my channel like this where I cover more US highways. I also cover interstates, interstate highways, and I also look into and review control cities. Anyways, see you guys next time. Bye.